What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 95, and I'm the co host of the show, Kyle Anslone, joined by the co host, Will Porter. Will, how's it going, buddy?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How you doing, man?
Pretty good. I mean, last week was a pretty big week in news. We got a lot of stuff to cover. Obviously, not going to get to all the big stories going on in the U.S. today, although I'm sure we will get to things like the Chauvin trial eventually. But we got a
Yeah.
lot of really important stories today. The talks with Iran unfolding, different laws dealing with policing here in the U.S. So I think it'll be a pretty great show today. So be sure to share the show. You can find it video versions up at YouTube and at Odyssey. Odyssey's a great place to subscribe to the show because you don't have to worry about censorship there. Who knows what the YouTube algorithms are going to flag? You say COVID too many times in the same podcast that you're talking about war and stuff like that, and then the trips up. So definitely check out the Odyssey channel. We're posting our content on MeWe, Facebook, and Twitter. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and the sponsor of the show is Paloma Verde. And you go palomaverdestore.com for your CBD products. They sell a variety of great products there. You could get your CBD in several different ways. Will, you like the Ed Strats and the soft gels, right?
Yeah, the oil extract, the one that has the biggest dose is my favorite, and same with the melatonin soft gels are the best to help me wind down. It's
Yeah.
my favorite products there.
And I enjoy the topicals. I know they sell different lotions and stuff like that, which are great for dry hands. You also have stuff that you could rub on like a specific spot that you're feeling pain and feel some relief. So see how CBD could help you. Go plumaverdestore.com. Use the promo code PEACE when you check out. It will get you a discount and it will help out the show. Again, plumaverdestore.com, promo code PEACE. Will, let's get into the show today, and we're just going to get right into it and start off with Iran,
Let's do
where
it.
we have some talks going on. A lot of concern going, that we talked about in the first couple of months of the Biden administration here. Well, that it doesn't seem like the Biden administration is serious about talking with Iran and getting back within the nuclear deal. But the first sign that that may not be the case and that they're serious about taking this really important step we saw last week with some indirect talks in Vienna. So, what were the outcomes of the talks that we know so far?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think we've mentioned this on the show before, but yeah, these are indirect talks where they're not actually sitting down at a table together to negotiate. They're kind of having intermediaries and go-betweens, like exchange proposals with various working groups on different issues. I think they had three different meetings last week in Vienna. And there have been a lot of ups and downs throughout that, but unfortunately, it seems that a lot of my and our concerns that we've talked about on the show about the U.S.'s approach to this issue seem to have been kind of vindicated, at least so far. So on Wednesday, after the second day of talks, I think the first day was slightly not as eventful, but on Wednesday we had the State Department saying some seemingly promising stuff that the U.S. is prepared to drop sanctions and to return to the nuclear deal. And that looked good. That was sort of one of the more outward statements that we've gotten so far about their willingness to drop sanctions. However, as often happens, there was kind of a poison pill baked into that. And if you go and read the full State Department briefing from Wednesday, you'll see it's not quite as good and promising as it sounds. So we had Ned Price, the top State Department spokesman. He ends up saying that the U.S. will drop sanctions that are inconsistent with the nuclear deal. And so they're making some kind of distinctions about which ones they'll keep and drop. However, he refused to say which ones that would include. He says, we don't know yet. And then later in the briefing, he said that the U.S. and its allies will continue to hold Iran accountable for all these things, for ballistic missiles, for alleged human rights abuses, for their support for, he said, terrorism. They usually just mean Hezbollah, supporting Hezbollah. And he suggested the U.S. would not be lifting sanctions related to those issues without kind of directly saying it. He very strongly suggested that these would remain. And the Iranians have responded to that publicly. We don't really see what they're saying to each other behind closed doors here, but we do see the public statements. And the Iranians have said that they believe that all the sanctions imposed on them under Donald Trump were inconsistent with the nuclear deal. And their foreign minister, Javad Zarif, said, like, regardless of any arbitrary designations that they're giving them, whether they're saying they had some non-nuclear justification, the Iranians say that all the U.S. sanctions on them, imposed on them after Trump violated the nuclear deal in 2018, that all of those are inconsistent with the JCPOA. And so that does seem to be a major impasse here. just given and given the statements from the U.S. side, I'm really not sure how likely it is they'll resolve this impasse in Vienna. You
So,
know,
Will, just so these are probably like examples of the Trump administration labeling the IRGC a terrorist organization and the sanctions that have come along with that. Uh, I'm assuming that's what they're talking about here, and that's why. So this is really a big deal. It's not like he like had some one-off sanction or something like that. There were a lot of other sanctions that Trump put on Iran that were separate from the nuclear deal issue.
Yeah, that's correct. There were a litany of different sanctions that didn't have explicit like nuclear related justification, but it was all part of this what Trump called the maximum pressure campaign. So yeah, like the Biden State Department is suggesting that like a lot of these sanctions will remain in force, and the Iranians have sort of made it very clear that they won't accept that. That no, all the sanctions imposed under Donald Trump have to be lifted before they start considering returning to full compliance with the deal. Um, and now another major issue here that's sort of related is that the Iranians are insisting that the U.S. has to drop all the sanctions up front and return to the JCPOA before they'll, take any steps to return to the deal. We've explained this on the show before, but after Trump violated the nuclear deal and withdrew from it in 2018, Iran began to take some measures to sort of scale back its own commitments. Most of those having to do with like boosting its uranium enrichment program. The caps on that were set out under the deal, they kind of said, fine, we'll just, break those caps. If you're not going to abide by your terms of the agreement, we're not going to either. And so the Iranians have said all along the U.S. has to drop its sanctions first, and then they might consider coming back to it. The Biden administration has floated this idea of sort of like a step-by-step incremental plan that like, the U.S. will give a little, Iran will give a little. But the Iranians have rejected that repeatedly, saying, no, you just have to drop the sanctions and then we'll consider joining the deal. However, Price, the State Department spokesman, he floated that proposal again last week. This time he kind of gave it a new name. He called it compliance for compliance. But nonetheless, they are sticking to this idea that like we'll go a little bit, both sides will give a little bit at a time. But the Iranians are not. It doesn't sound like they're okay with that. So that's another major impasse here that I'm not really sure they're going to resolve in these negotiations, given the sort of public statements from both sides. It seems like both sides are kind of sticking to their guns about this. And so, yeah, that's sort of, some of my observations of the talks last week. Like I said, we don't get to actually sit in or see the negotiations themselves. We kind of only get the briefings and stuff that come after. But these were two major issues in terms of like the order in which we would, go back to compliance, as well as which sanctions they're going to consider lifting. And it sounds like there's quite a few that they're, considering keeping in place.
Right. So, well, do you know the logistics of how these talks work? Because they were indirect talks. So, like, did the U.S. hand the French foreign minister a statement? They went right to the Iranians and, like, they were in the same hotel and in different rooms? Or was this, like, essentially a Zoom call where, like, you weren't on the same call, but somebody was on the call with both of you at the same time? Exactly how I guess the dynamics of these talks works, because I believe it was Iran that actually drew the line and said, no, we said we're not going to talk to the U.S. until they lift sanctions, and that's why it was indirect talks.
Yeah, that's correct. I'm not 100% sure of like exactly the logistics. As far as I understand, there's two separate working groups. There's a group talking about how Iran will return to the deal, and then there's a group talking about how the U.S. will return to the deal. And apparently there are various, meetings going on, and they're passing along proposals to each other. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure of like exactly how that works.
So, one thing to just remember when Trump broke the deal, I think it was like in May of 2018, and they started reapplying sanctions in late 2018, like in November, 6 months after he broke the deal. But he had already been applying other sanctions to Iran. Iran also argued that the U.S. was then out of compliance with the deal, pretty much since Trump took office, because part of it, the deal was that America was supposed to promote business between the West and Iran, and with even the threat of sanctions, you're really undermining that. So Iran been arguing the whole time that America was in violation of the agreement because of that. But once the U.S. broke the agreement, Iran did wait before it's not like they started enriching uranium 20% December of 2019. That's a step that they only took in January of 2021 after a slow process of saying, please return to the deal, or we're going to, do this, reducing our commitments to the deal. Because again, well, why would you stay committed to a deal that the other side is broke? If like a landlord has evicted you from the apartment, you're not going to keep paying rent. And that's, kind of what the Americans were expecting, I think, the Iranians to do here. And it makes 100% sense to me why they wouldn't do that. And so I guess, is there any indication on the American side of understanding the situation from the Iranian point of view? Or does it seem like they're trying to play the hard line here because, Democrats have to be tough?
Yeah, it kind of sounds more like the latter, that they're just trying to take this hardline stance. I think they understand what the Iranians are asking for. And as you said, it doesn't seem all that unreasonable. Like the Iranians are really just saying, we're not going to give you further concessions just to have you do what you already agreed to do, just to have you stick to your word. We're not going to give up more and give you concessions for that. Like, no, come back to do what you say you're going to do, and we will, return to the agreement. But yeah, it does seem the Biden administration, like, I don't think it's that complex or complicated to understand what the Iranians are asking for. I think they just kind of want to avoid the perception that, oh, you gave away the farm to the Iranians, you did what they are asking for, even if what they're asking for isn't all that unreasonable. And you would think, too, that given the fact that Trump was the one who violated the deal and brought back all these sanctions, it shouldn't be that hard for them just politically to say, like, the prior administration made mistakes and was poor at diplomacy, and just, we're taking a new approach. But no, I'm like, this is becoming a very common theme on the show, that Biden just, it seems very beholden and stuck to this momentum that Trump set for him. And it's not really clear why. It seems like he'd have a really good political opening, especially with Democrats, fellow Democrats. It's not that hard to say, I'm breaking with the previous administration and taking a new approach.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point, because essentially what Iran is asking for here, Will, is to reset the relationship to January 2017, which
Correct,
was when the Obama administration left. And so, as you say, saying that, yeah, we're all set with going back to that point in time. Everything looks great to me, and moving on. But, well, one of the things I guess I want to talk about, and one that I think complicating factors, is Iran plays a very important role in the U.S. empire, because it is the reason for the continued American empire's presence in the Middle East. We have to support all these other states to combat Iran's malign influence. That's why we're involved in Syria and Yemen, and that's why we bat the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris and the Israelis. And so Israel has been a big obstacle, at times threatening to attack Iran should the Biden administration return to the deal. Any idea on how they're reacting to these talks? I guess I haven't seen the Israelis throw too much of a fit, but then just before we recorded, Will, I noticed that Iran was reporting that there was a cyber attack at their Natanz facility that caused a blackout. I have no idea to the extent of the attack or if it actually happened, but at this point, the Iranians believe they were the victim of a cyber attack, either by Israel or the U.S., and so that could certainly dampen the ability for talks. But I was just wondering if you had any details on what the Israeli stance has been in the past week.
Yeah, I know, like, I'm not sure exactly in the last week. I know Netanyahu has obviously railed against the deal repeatedly, including in the sort of lead up to these Vienna talks. I know they've been, trying to trash it. I believe there was an Israeli intelligence chief is either planning on visiting or already did visit the U.S. to try to discourage, the revival of the JCPOA. Mm-hmm. But more specifically, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head any Israeli quotes or responses to this. Generally, though, the reaction has been very hostile and very skeptical of the deal. Netanyahu repeatedly said it was the worst agreement ever signed in a very Trumpian kind of way. And obviously, yeah, the Israelis have a major interest in keeping the hostile relationship between the U.S. and Iran. That is sort of like one of the reasons why, one of the justifications for supporting the Israelis is, like as a counter against the Iranians in the region.
Right. So, Will, I'm assuming this cyber attack, it turns out to be what the Iranians believe it is. I'm sure we'll be talking about this later in the week, but is there anything else on the Iran issue that we should talk about now? Or is there anything that you're like a plan for a next round of talks, or do we know what the progress or the progression here is supposed to look like? I think the U.S. kind of signaled that they were looking at a long progress, which I guess it seems concerning to me. Long for a government diplomatic process. What's that? 6 months, a year at the minimum, when Iran's going to go through a pretty serious round of elections and may have a government that's not as interested, and certainly won't have somebody as I think diplomatic as Jawad Zarif to deal with as Iran's foreign minister if there's a more hardline administration in Iran that comes to power in June as expected. And so, do we have any idea on timeline here?
Well, I do believe they're supposed to sit down again next week for talks. I'm not exactly sure how long those talks are supposed to last, but you are correct. The State Department spokesperson Price had said something about how this is going to be a long road, and there's a lot of, it's going to be a long time before we, reach agreement on this stuff. And yes, that is a very important element. This upcoming election, I think in June in Iran, that like I think will partially be a referendum on Hassan Rouhani and his administration and how they've overseen, diplomatic relations with the United States. We've made this point on the show repeatedly, but I think it's worth stressing that Trump's abrogation of the nuclear deal was a humiliation for sort of what we call the moderate faction in Iran. It made the hardliners, like it sort of allowed them to say, I told you so. Look, you cannot deal with the USA. You cannot trust what US leaders say. And it appears that by Trump doing that, that sort of vindicated what they were saying there. And so I think that that'll be a very important thing in the upcoming election. And obviously, I think that the negotiators will be considering that. I think they're going to be very cautious about getting burned again like this because of just like the humiliation and the political damage. So there is sort of a time frame here with this election coming up in June for them to solve something. And I don't want to be too pessimistic about it, but to me right now, it doesn't look like the chances are too great that this will happen before then.
Right. Well, and then just another concern that I have is if the Iranians do make any concessions at all, the Hots in the U.S. are going, oh my God, the sanctions work. Look how well the maximum pressure campaign worked. Look what Iran conceded because of the U.S. sanctions and how powerful and great they are. I saw today on Twitter a bunch of people pushing the sanctions narrative, saying we just got to hold out a little longer. The sanctions are working. The Iranian economy is being devastated. My question for them is really how many Iranian children are you willing to, make suffer? And, we know that there's consequences in Iran with the lack of access to medicine, especially like dialysis, like long-term care, cancer medications are in short supply. That includes cancer medications, for little kids who have leukemia and terrible stuff like that. And then there's also just increased deaths of deprivation in Iran because people have less. Like, how much suffering are you willing to inflict on them to get the, political concessions that you think are so important when, the U.S. has a real alternative here to just leave the Middle East? And then the other thing I want to mention is there's a pretty good interview with Scott Horton and Trita Parsi I listened to today, and one of the things that they pointed out, which I thought was really important, was getting back in this deal is critical to the U.S. being able to leave the Middle East, because the Iran is such a perceived threat in this deal. While it's not 100% necessary to for the U.S. to leave the Middle East, as far as me and you are concerned, Will, for I think the political dynamics of the U.S. and everything that happens, having a deal that says Iran isn't building a nuclear weapon and having international watchdogs certify every 90 days that they're definitely not building a nuclear weapon means that there's no excuse of a nuclear round to keep the U.S. in the Middle East, and the allies, the Israelis, the Saudis, the Emiratis, where I can't fearmonger off it. And right. So getting back at this deal is critical to getting out in the Middle East, and that's why it's so important and why we talked about it so much and why we're so concerned the Biden administration is botching a great opportunity here to have a good foreign policy win pretty close to the start of his administration.
Absolutely. Well said.
All right. Well, North Korea is not going to the Olympics, which is a little bit disappointing. Why aren't they going? And any other details we should know here?
Yeah. I thought this one was, I don't have a ton on this, but I do think it was at least worth mentioning. There's some significance here. They say this decision is because of COVID, that they don't want to, they won't be sending athletes. They don't want to have them travel to these other countries and then come back and bring the virus to North Korea. And the North Koreans claim they have 0 infections there. I think they definitely were claiming that at one point. I think they still claim that they have 0 COVID infections. Pretty questionable claim, but that is nonetheless what they say. And apparently they've taken some pretty hardcore measures to keep the virus out. They've, I think completely shut down their borders, more so than they were before. Now, you know, as often is the case with North Korea, there could be some ulterior motive here. I'm not really sure what it would be. Maybe sending a message to the Japanese or something. Maybe you have some other speculation there. But you know, regardless of whether there's some other reason of them doing this, as opposed to the stated reason of COVID, I think this is unfortunate from the standpoint of inter-Korean relations. People might recall that there was all kinds of engagement between the two Koreas during the 2018 Winter Games that were held in South Korea. They had athletes competing on a single team, I think, for at least one sport, maybe multiple. And then they also did this big joint opening ceremony under a unification flag. Like that was a pretty huge deal, like as if they were sort of one country. And it paved the way for all kinds of talks between the two sides, between their leaders, as well as talks between the U.S., and North Korea that were like almost actually successful, that actually nearly led to something good. We covered all that kind of stuff in our article for the Libertarian Institute last year. People can find that if they just search our names and maximum failure on Google. But we kind of got into all the talks that sprang from the 2018 Olympics and all the possibilities that they created. It seemed to open up all this like room for dialogue and diplomacy. However, with North Korea bowing out this year, unfortunately, we will not have any of that this time around. I just thought that was sort of worth noting. And another thing too this week that we've been had some reports on is how the future Olympics might sort of have the opposite effect on U.S. and Chinese relations, as opposed, you know, with the Koreans, it seems to have had a good effect. Whereas now we have the U.S. State Department suggesting that they could boycott the 2022 Olympics in Beijing over, allegations of human rights abuses in Xinjiang and genocide and all that stuff. You and Pat McFarland covered that on the show last week really well. But there've been the State Department later came out and sort of walked that back, said that like, oh, there's actually no plans currently for a boycott. But for whatever reason, Ned Price decided to kind of put that proposal out there. I don't know why they did that. And it's caused controversy. The Chinese said that, like, please don't politicize sports on us here, and don't, they vowed some kind of vague response. But I just thought there was kind of an interesting contrast there, just how the Olympics have provided a great opportunity for the Koreans to improve diplomacy, but the USA is trying to use them to gin up conflict and hostility.
Right. I mean, that seems to be like the state of the U.S. politics now, like anything possible. We even saw the same thing, a similar thing with Russia, because I think they're unable to compete under the Russian flag for the upcoming games because of a doping scandal. And correct, yeah. During the time, the U.S. was like, "Ha, see, I told you so," and like really playing it up and even trying to tie it into the Russiagate narrative and stuff like that. So it gets pretty absurd at how, something like sports, which should be just something to bring us together internationally. Rocky Balboa versus Drago or whatever, bringing the whole world together. But it's Ron Paul's thing, and so for that reason, I always thought that we should try listen to the old doctor and realize what he has to say probably has some relevance there. That the best thing the U.S. could be doing is playing baseball with the Japanese and the Soviets and the Koreans and all that. I do assume that it is because of COVID. I don't see any reason why the Koreans wouldn't want to march into Japan under a united banner. I think that would probably just drive them absolutely nuts in the elites in Tokyo at least. But I guess it's probably COVID related reasons. It seems that they are being very serious about trying to keep COVID out of that country. And that's their plan. And again, I said that there are probably ways to keep COVID out of your country. You just got to be able to do things that most people aren't willing to do, like skip the Olympics. So, and far more brutal and serious things, but that adds to the list. Well, let's talk about this Florida law, which got some attention, and you wrote up an article on. So what's going on with this law?
Yeah, so I thought this was interesting, especially because similar laws have been passed in a few other states already, so this isn't quite as local as it might seem at first. But last week we had this appeals court in Florida ruling that police officers can conceal their names and identities from the public after they're involved in like fatal shootings and other kind of like violent encounters on duty. Like in a case where a cop kills somebody, oftentimes it is something like the names of the officers is something that gets released sort of in the interest of the public, that, police officers are supposed to be public servants. After all, they're sort of acting this official capacity. They are agents of the state. However, in Florida and a few other states, they have this thing called Marsy's Law. And this law was originally passed in California back in 2008, but it's been picked up elsewhere, I think now in 11 states in total. And it's supposed to give protections to like crime victims to sort of help them conceal their names and identities so that their perpetrators can't like find them and harass them during criminal proceedings to intimidate them or whatever. But in a few of these states that have passed this stuff called Marsy's Law, they've tweaked the language slightly to make it so where cops can also invoke this thing after they shoot somebody on duty and say that like they are a victim of a violent crime and that they get all the same protections as anyone else, so they should be able to, hide their names. Um, Now, last year we had this other court in Florida originally striking this down. There were two officers in Tallahassee, Florida, who in two separate cases, two different incidents, shot suspects and killed them, armed suspects. And the city was talking about releasing their names just in the public interest. And the cops sued them to stop that from happening. And last year, this court ended up ruling against the cops, saying that like even if a cop technically is the victim of a crime, and even if they shot in self-defense, that like they were attacked by a perpetrator or a suspect, nonetheless, the nature of their job being a public job and the fact that they are government officials means they can't hide their names. They can't conceal that. Like citizens have a right to know these things if they have to sort of hold the state accountable for misconduct. However, the cops and the union appealed that ruling. And last week, this appeals court decided that they were right and that the cops can hide their identities after all. And they tossed out that previous decision.
Well, can I ask a clarifying question here? Because you said that if a cop is like so let's say the cop was like somebody was beating on a cop, and the cop was actually had to shoot the guy in self-defense, shoot and kills a guy who would have killed him otherwise, right? Is that cop entitled to the same thing as a cop who shoots somebody who's unarmed and who hasn't hit the guy? There's no clear like assault, or there wouldn't have been maybe assaulting an officer charge. So does there have to be something that makes the officer the victim of a crime, or is in this case merely an officer shooting somebody made that officer the victim too?
Yeah, the distinction here is indeed that they have to be the victim of a crime. However, the thing is like often like in virtually all, I don't know why I'm say all, but in many, many shootings, the cops often do immediately come up with that justification that the guy did something that warranted this deadly force and that like he was going to attack me or something like that. So that's like sort of the standard defense of police officers in these situations, is that like I would have been the victim of something. Now, in these two cases in Tallahassee, these two cops, I think it was pretty clear that like the suspects were armed and the cop was retreating when he shot them and stuff. Like there are cases where people just attack cops and, they shoot them in legit self-defense. However, I think the sort of wider issue here is that it will sort of this law, this ruling will have an effect on sort of the transparency of police departments, that they're immediately going to just say that, oh, yeah, the cop was the victim of a crime and now we get to conceal their names. So overall, I think this will be kind of a blanket blow to transparency from police departments in Florida, at least. Now, I said there are similar laws in 11 different states. I think it's only like 4 of them that have the specific language that allows cops to invoke it. But nonetheless, like, you only need to amend this legislation a little bit to do that. And so I think this could potentially become a wider issue well beyond Florida if, this idea kind of catches on more.
Right. Right, or even like slipping other like kind of similar provisions into other kind of legislation. You don't need the whole Marsy's Law. You just need the one little thing to protect police or public officials or something like that. Well, while we're on the subject of, police and, different legislation, it looks like we actually got some good news coming out of Maryland, where the police have a lot of something known as the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. It was actually passed first in Maryland, first day of any in 1947. It's been passed in 20-something states since, but that has now been repealed. There was a 4-part piece of legislation called the Police Accountability Act. And then the Governor Larry Hogan vetoed 3 parts of the 4 parts of that act, and all 3 were overridden by the Democratic House and I guess legislator in Maryland. Some things included in this bill: it's going to overhaul the disciplinary review for officers. That will set up a civilian board, although it seems like the civilian board will only be able to recommend punishment, not actually be able to hand it out. on this specific point, the police complain that it's a transparency issue, that basically any trivial complaint made about a police officer will be able to become public, even if it's completely baseless or not. I think there was, one officer complaining that essentially this will allow, even if he's off duty, somebody calls in a complaint on him, that would become a matter of public record. And, it does seem like there would be some ridiculous instances like that, but also so much of what police do gets brushed under the rug. It's important for everything to be public. And also just, remember, if you're reading stories about police complaints from Maryland going forward, will be able to publish any complaint that's made, and so that doesn't mean that all of them are factually true. It's going to create a new legal standard for police force. They use words like necessary and proportional. What that actually means in practice, I don't know. That part of the law doesn't seem like it actually is going to protect people unless they really adopt standards for necessary and proportional that are meaningful. But officers who will be who are determined to use excessive force could face an additional charge that includes up to 10 years in prison. It puts limits on no-knock warrants. Of course, Duncan Lepp was somebody who was killed in Maryland by police on a no-knock warrant during a night raid, and those are both things limited in this bill, so that's some good news. It's going to, again, repeal the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights that has been put in place. James Bovard has pointed out that that's the kind of thing that will let police not have to answer questions after they use lethal force for 10 days. And so, really, think about what that means. You really line up your story real well if you got 10 days to think about it and to make sure that, it's a situation like in Florida, right? Well, you got to come up with some way that guy was about to assault you. And so you could get away with your crime. And then there's also the Juvenile Restoration Act, which is part of the bill that got a lot of heat from Republicans, but to me it sounds like actually a pretty reasonable thing. It's for minors who served 20 years in jail so far and were convicted in an adult court as a minor. So you're 17, you kill somebody, you get life in prison. Under this law, you can now ask for a review, and then it's like a parole board. So basically, you just can't give a juvenile life without parole, and that's a new thing that's instated in this law as well. And again, parole, you go and sit in front of a board after several, probably a couple decades here. It's not like, the Republicans pretend like these, kids are going to shoot somebody, then get out of jail 3 years later. That's not what's going on here. And then it looks like people who feel like their civil liberties have been violated from the city will be able to sue for more, $890K. That's up from $400,000, and it will also mandate body camera use. So, well, I mean, some good things in there. Of course, like all legislation, it depends on how it gets enforced. It could be completely meaningless in the end, or it could be a significant step in the right direction for policing in Maryland. I don't know if you had any thoughts on the law.
Yeah, just like especially that first part you mentioned there about like some kind of civilian or police officers are civilians. That's a I fell into that issue just now. But like an outside non-cop review board for complaints against cops, I think that kind of stuff is important because like as so often happens, like in this case in Florida, this appeals court ruled that like even though cops can conceal their identities, hey, like internal reviews can still happen and prosecutors can still review police's actions and find misconduct. However, I think it is important to have these sort of outside institutions and outside agencies that aren't like buddy with the, whether it's the police department itself or some, public prosecutor who is sort of, his career depends on keeping a good relation with the police. And so I think it is good to have these like, non-police review boards and stuff to look at potential misconduct, because I think internal reviews often kind of have a tendency to brush things under the rug. But if that's all you had to say about this, that police reform bill, I think we can shift gears here to other wider national issues. So we, on a recent show, talked about recent reports about Biden's budget proposal for the Pentagon for 2022 and sort of what that might look like. We were speculating a bit about what he might decide to do with the overseas contingency budget, the money that are used to fight wars. I kind of didn't think that would be likely. Trump had called to cut that budget before he left office. I didn't think really Biden would do that. However, I think we have some updates on just the general on his DoD budget that he's going to put forward. So, what do you have on that?
Yeah, so the Biden administration has outlined their, I guess, overall total budget for 2022, and then the Pentagon budget, which is about half of the spending that's going to be passed. It'll be about 1.5 trillion. Of course, that doesn't count all the extra spending that gets passed and everything. Well, this is just like, the welfare and the Pentagon budget essentially. That we're talking about here. And so the Pentagon budget itself is $715 billion. That's not, the total budget spent on U.S. defense. That's the Pentagon budget, which are two different things. The nuclear weapons are part of the Department of Energy, which I believe is included in this will. And with the Department of Energy, the defense budget bumps up to $753 billion. This is about a 1.5% increase of the defense budget, and this is a little bit less than the budget that Trump proposed for 2022, which came in at $722 billion. We don't yet know all the details of this plan, so where the Biden administration is looking to spend money, or how many F-35s are they buying, or what kind of ships are they, all that stuff we'll find out sometime in the next couple of months. But we just had the general outlines. They say that they're prioritizing countering China, they're investing in the Navy fleet and nuclear weapons, and they're preparing for plans to mitigate climate change, which makes absolutely no sense if you're spending $250 billion on the largest polluter on the planet, the Pentagon, how you're going to promote climate change and all of that. I don't know if they're going to try to mount some solar panels on the F-35 or what the actual plan is there. This is less than the Republicans want it. They want a 3 to 5% increase. And so again, the Biden administration actually has to propose this, and it has to go through the House and the Senate. And so it could end up being more. It typically ends up being more. Sometimes the Biden administration did say they were looking to cut some legacy programs, and it seemed like the Navy was concerned about the cuts being in their branch on the legacy programs. And so, whatever send or state the ships that are going to get cut or built in may end up getting those ships put in the budget, even if the Biden administration, didn't want to pay for those. The Progressive Caucus chair, the House Progressive Caucus chair, called actually for a cut in defense spending. They're looking for like a 10% cut. There's other groups that are demanding like up to a $300 billion cut, which of course would still give the U.S. A military budget twice the size of the next country, which would be China. Let's see, anything else here? I think those are most of the details that we know about the budget so far. Well, again, there is, of course, the total budget of 1.5 trillion. Again, the defense is about half of that, and this includes all the welfare spending and on the different departments. And so Health and Human Services, Justice, Education, I think are all getting a bump. I think the Department of Agriculture is getting a pretty big bump, and the Department of Commerce as well. And so I'm not sure if Republicans are going to be able to make an argument to say, hey, you want to spend 2.3 trillion on infrastructure. We just passed another 2 trillion on COVID after how they spent 6 trillion on COVID last year aside from the regular budget. And so now they want to spend another 1.5 trillion. It's amazing that they don't feel the need to look for cuts somewhere, but so I don't know. Well, you could say what you want about the budget. It's absolutely out of control. It's insane, and I'm sure in the coming weeks when we find out how many F-35s they're buying and stuff like that, we'll break down more of the individual purchases on the show. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this 715 or 700 billion keeps us still like outspending, I think, the next top 10, the next largest militaries on planet Earth. And that includes China and Russia and all of our greatest adversaries and all of our allies that we could, we still spend more than the next 10 of them combined, which is kind of outrageous. But it does seem that this proposal, it seems to vindicate what Mark Perry was reporting about. He was talking about a desire to sort of the word he used was flatline the Pentagon budget, which means sort of neither pass any major cuts or any major increases, but to just sort of keep it where it is under Trump. However, as we've talked about so many times, Trump oversaw massive increases in spending. So simply keeping those there is it's like, it seems like the safe, moderate proposal, but it's still a pretty radical idea that you're going to be keeping those that high, that you wouldn't, like, again, this is an area where I think Biden could easily say, like, my predecessor was foolish and we're taking a different approach. But nonetheless, it seems he wants to, at least if Mark Perry's reporting is anything to go by, it seems he wants to focus on his domestic agenda rather than, starting a fight over the military budget.
Right. Well, to me, it would be something that would show the government was really serious about COVID, right? Like, we have a unique biological threat, and so we have to divert money away from defense spending in order to combat that, or at least combat the effects of that, making everybody homeless and mentally ill for, everybody's, now not feeling, it's a terrible situation what they've done with the COVID reaction. And so if you're serious about fighting that, you would think that maybe this would be a place that you could make some cuts to say, like, hey, we're doing the best we can to reprioritize because we know we're making everybody else reprioritize their lives, and they won't do it. They're still going to write the big checks to all their donors in the military industrial complex. And it just shows what a joke these people are.
That's right. It's like Bob Higgs always says, the ratchet effect, that like every increase in government power, it just becomes the new baseline. You can never undo that. And in another area, it seems that might be happening. I think there's a little bit of uncertainty here. But I guess the Biden administration is embracing landmines. I think there was some decision under the previous administration on that it seems that that Biden is going to keep around, I think there's some uncertainty about that. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So during the Trump administration, the Pentagon changed their policy on landmines, saying that they would have like some use in conventional warfare. And so I believe the Pentagon was asked about that, and this is the statement here Spencer Ackerman tweeted out, where the Department of Defense says that their landmine policy remains unchanged, and they have assessed that the landmines are could be useful in a conventional warfare situation. And so it kind of seemed to suggest that Biden, who had made a campaign promise to get rid of to reverse the landmine policy, and we have the receipts here from the VOTS article, where Biden weighed in as well. The Trump administration's reversal of years of considered decisions by Democratic and Republican presidents to curtail the use of landmines is another reckless act by the president, ill-suited to serve as commander-in-chief. It will put more civilians at risk of being injured by unexploded mines and is unnecessary from a military perspective. As president, I will promptly roll back this misguided decision. And so 2 months into your presidency, if your Pentagon is saying that you assess that landmines are useful in a conventional sense, it doesn't seem like you're very prompt about that promise at the very least. So Biden's not living up to his promise. But then 2 days later, we had a statement from Biden's ambassador to the UN. I believe her name is Linda Thomas Greenfield. And she said that Mr. Biden intends to roll back the policy, and our administration has begun a policy review to do that. If you intend to roll back the policy, why review you don't need to review the policy, you just roll it back. Now, of course, the problem is that landmines are something that get left around, and years after conflict, people end up dying from them. And so that's why we want to, not use them. It's just a cruel weapon of war, like a cluster bomb. And so to try to eliminate those from the battlefield are great. And while Biden made this promise, it seems like he's at least wishy-washy on it at this point, and may not intend to uphold his promise and actually roll this thing back.
Right. Yeah. We've talked, I think, a little bit about how I was going to make the comparison to cluster munitions as well, that like in some of these conflict zones, like in Vietnam, like I think there's still to this day, random civilians, innocent people just come across these mines and get blown up that have been sitting under there for years and years. And so, yeah, that's a kind of an interesting dispute there. But yeah, it sounds sort of like the Biden administration, maybe the left hand isn't communicating with the right hand, that the military is still convinced that this is the current policy, whereas the civilian side is like, we don't know, we want to reverse that. You would think, though, that wouldn't be too hard to just quietly write that, new rule. Why do they have to do this big review, this sort of like wishy-washy process? Yeah. However, another I'm sorry, did you have anything else on
I
landmine?
was just going to add, it could signal, I guess, some disagreement within the Biden administration.
Right.
And, this would be something that I feel like in the early days of the Trump administration would, huge reports, contradiction in the Trump administration that say, a U.S. ambassador to the UN isn't on the same page as the Pentagon. This is a big
Right.
deal.
What a mess.
But really, the reporting on what Miss Thomas Greenfield said, the ambassador to the UN, was almost non-existent. I think only like the National covered it. Couldn't find other stories on it. So it seems like maybe the Pentagon is just weighing out because their narrative is the one being trumpeted, really. And it does say that they're undergoing a policy review right now. Who knows how long it's going to take for this policy review to actually work itself out and what the outcome of it will be. And if that even means the policy will change in the end.
Right. Yeah, we've had a lot of these sort of in the first few months of the Biden administration, a lot of these like policy reviews, which seems to sort of help to take off heat of like, all these reporters asking, hey, are you going to change this policy? Are you going to reverse that? And they can kind of like stretch it out for a few, hey, we're doing a policy review. Give us like 7 months to figure out what we want to say about that. So it seems to kind of take some heat off themselves for sure.
You'll circle back to the policy review.
That's right. Yeah, circle right back. But now, in terms of the Biden administration reversing previous foolish policies under the Trump administration, we do have one story here from last week of a clear case of that. And, we talk about sanctions on the show a lot. And oftentimes I think we kind of just assume that like they are sanctioning who they claim to be sanctioning. But you have this story from last week where that was very much not the case, where there was this pizza shop that got swept up in some sanctions on a foreign country. And so tell us about that. Was there some conspiracy for this pizzeria to smuggle oil in out of Venezuela, or what's the deal with that?
Yeah, so everybody assumes that the government's competent, and when they try to drone strike somebody, they drone strike the right guy. And hell, I even assume when they sanction somebody, they sanction the right guy. But Salon got this story where it turns out they didn't do such a good job in the last day of the Trump administration. So, as everybody knows, the last day of the administration is kind of wild. Everybody's trying to finagle for a pardon. And they were also trying to get sanctions applied to different people. And some of the sanctions that Trump signed were against people who were apparently doing business with the Venezuelan state oil company. There was an Italian man that there is some suspicion that he was involved. I have no idea if this guy was involved. The first Alessandro Bazzani, but there are at least two other people in Italy with the same name, and so all three of the Bazzanis got sanctioned. One of them owns a graphics lab, so like does design, and the other one owns a pizzeria, and the pizzeria was sanctioned, and the bank discovered actually the pizza owner discovered that he didn't have access to his banks anymore, and I guess remained under the sanctions, it seems like, for at least a month or two before the U.S. kind of realized this mistake and corrected it. And I'm sure it was a very troubling time. Well, can you imagine I can't access my bank account, so I have no cash, right? I gotta pay for groceries. You gotta call your grandma and say, Grandma, can I borrow some money? I'm sanctioned by the U.S. government. I can't get into my bank account. Shit, everybody's gonna assume you're a terrorist, this poor man. And it just shows how incompetent the U.S. government is. And I was, really concerned that, when this happens in Italy, right, it seems like something that can get worked out. Like, these people are all in Western countries. In Italy is a NATO government. This guy owns an Italian pizzeria, right? Like, maybe that's a front for the mafia, but it's not a front for international sanctions filing. That would have to be, I think, the assumption most people have. But let's say, your name is like Mohammed Abdullah, right? And you live in Somalia, and you get sanctioned by the U.S., and it's for some other guy who's suspected of being ISIS, but they also stick it to you. Like, do you think you have any chance of getting off the? I would guess it's probably very low. So that was another concern I had in all this. Is I wonder how many times other people are accidentally sanctioned and aren't able to get their names off the list because they don't live in Italy or France or Spain or somewhere you could get that kind of thing done.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was gonna say. It's just like how many other times has this happened for someone who just has no way of like this? It would never get to the public eye. This guy is just like living in this Kafka-esque situation where he's sanctioned for like some crazy international thing, and he's just running his pizza shop and has no idea what they're talking about. Yeah, that's just a hilarious. It's not hilarious. It's really it sucks for the guy. But here we actually do have a very clear case where they did actually reverse the previous administration's policy. I think they did. They did right to take off the sanctions. They
Yeah.
admitted their
And
mistakes.
apparently they framed it as apologizing, which is absolutely insane because what does the U.S. government ever apologize for? I was just reading today, what was the massacre of the South Korean citizens, Row, some I can't remember exactly.
I'm not sure, man.
Yeah, they killed the U.S. during the Korean War. There were a bunch of unarmed South Korean civilians, and they just gunned them all down. It was an awful massacre. Everybody knows it happened. And Bill Clinton didn't offer an explicit apology. You know, he offered his regrets, but it specifically didn't apologize. And so it's one of those crazy things where this guy got an actual apology. It reminds me of that Jeopardy clip. I don't know if you've caught it, Will, but they asked people like who got money from the U.S. government after a tragedy, and you know one person guessed slaves, and the next person guessed Gitmo detainees. And I forget what the third guess, well, maybe American Indians or something like that, Native Americans, and it was the Iran hostages that got the money. So it wasn't victims of the U.S. aggression. It was victims of poor U.S. foreign policy. So,
Right.
all right,
Yeah,
well,
that's all.
oh,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, I was just going to wrap up. So go ahead, and then we'll wrap up.
No, that's exactly what I was gonna do as well. So go
All
ahead.
right,
You're
great.
you're better. You're,
Anyways, everybody, be sure to check out the show somewhere. Subscribe to a YouTube or Odyssey for video versions. Audio's up everywhere. Give it a rating and review. We're putting out clips on our social media accounts, MeWe, Facebook, and Twitter. Be sure to check that out. If you see it in there, share the show. That really helps us out. You could donate to the show at Patreon and at Subscribestar. Just search up conflicts of interest with either of those. And I think that's about it. Will, Paloma Verde is the show sponsor. Check out their products. Check out the Libertarian Institute. You could get some sweet swag like Will Porter is modeling over there from through the website. And again, appreciate everybody for listening to the show and sharing it and listening to everything we're doing. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, everybody. See ya, guys.